I think we are. Rachel, do you want to come in for a minute? Okay. All right. So welcome to the second general session. We've got three great panelists today. The first I'd like to introduce is
just a quick correction. There's 4 panelists, and I hope you have all 4 of them.
2, 3, 4. Yeah, if I could only count, my life would be much better. I've got John Wallingford, Jeremiah Scanlan, Representative Lynn, Bennion, and Kira Smiley. So I have 4 panelists. Thank you. And one other reminder before I jump into the introduction, please put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They preferred that they go to the Q&A button. Okay, well, let me jump in by welcoming and thanking John Wallingford, our first panelist. He is trained in nutrition and metabolism. There's John. And he's worked professionally at the FDA and the Wyeth Nutrition before completing his career as a consultant in the area of regulation of foods for special dietary uses. Now nearing retirement, as am I, he has undertaken to devote energy towards environmental care. With the congregation of St. John's Episcopal Cathedral and co-sponsors from Whitworth and Gonzaga University, he organized HOPE for conferences in 2022 and 2023 to encourage faith communities' environmental care. He's met through that environmental-minded persons across many sectors of society, and in and around Spokane, officials of city, county, and federal government. This is a great collection, John. Tribal members, academics, faith groups, the business community, and non-governmental environmental organizations. He sits on the Environment Committee planning at Expo 50, the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Spokane's Expo 74, the first ever World's Fair dedicated to the environment. Boy, what a great idea that is. He is certified as a Master Forest Steward by the University of Idaho. So thank you for being with us, John. We're grateful for you being here.
Thanks very much, Tom, and my thanks to MESA for this opportunity. It's an extraordinary one, and it's in line with what Tom was saying in the outset, that I've spent the last few years working to create a greater dialogue across a variety of faith communities about our shared interests in stewardship of the earth. And I welcome this opportunity to be able to speak with the Mormon community. It's really terrific. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I grew up in an environment where you talked from your slides, so I'm going to try to do that. Okay, there we go. So the title of my talk is Interfaith Perspectives. Can you folks see that? I'm not seeing my own. And I'm not hearing if someone.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great.
You might not be able to see it, but we can see it as an audience.
Okay. So interfaith perspectives is clearly something that is too much to cover in 5 minutes. What I think I can do is use this time to share how much value we've obtained by creating an environment that has established a new community, a broader community across different kinds of faith groups. And we've had great participation in each of our 2 conferences. So my disclaimers, I think Tom already read through. I'm a layperson. I'm coming into this as a matter of conscience and stewardship that stems from my faith. And I'm going to use my time to explain how that faith has informed and directed my work. We did have these 2 earlier conferences, the Hope for Creation Conference, back in 2022 and 2023, with a variety of groups. And I'll just use this as a jumping off point to say there is such a broad interest in caring for creation in secular and in faith communities. And my number one take home from working to put these conferences together is people are very interested and eager to speak and to share their perspectives. So we had government officials, we had tribal leaders, and as Tom went through the variety of groups that participated in our conferences, and we had great collaborations from the academic institutions in Spokane. So I encourage you to use this topic as a way of reaching out into the community that you might not otherwise have a chance to interact with. And I know that the symposium today is directed at public lands. I'm focused on that now. I would like to have some time, and don't today, although maybe since we've got a couple of attorneys on the program, we could talk about what the rights are that accrue to private land. There's this bundle of rights concept with possession and control and enjoyment, disposition and exclusion. And maybe we can come back to that in the discussion period of where there's a boundary between public and private rights and how to balance those. And I focus on this book that came up as we were preparing our second conference, book by Land, that was my first introduction to the bundle of rights. And I'll come back to some of the points that were made in that book as we go. Also, my apologies for joining late. I was in the Pacific time zone and I completely forgot to adjust my time. So I missed the earlier presentation by Nicole. So I hope this isn't redundant with what she said. But I would use this recent public lands proposal by the Bureau of Lands Management to suggest that we are at an important juncture in redefining the nature of public lands. So the Bureau of Lands Management in April proposed to add conservation as a permitted use of public lands, meaning that you would be able to petition for a lease to use the land for conservation or restoration purposes. And I think it's the leading edge of a concept that deserves a lot of support. We're looking at now bringing into the sphere of uses, and I have that word in quotes for a particular reason. I'll get to that in a second. The idea of using the land to not use the land is a great concept. Recognize the rights of the land itself in a land ethic. So keep that in mind as an area of work. I will say we wrote comments to that docket, and as in my history of occupation, I was a federal employee, so I know a little bit about the process of writing regulations, and I appreciate from that experience that the comments of an individual U.S. citizen on a proposed rule can change the mind of the government. It happened in my experience. And I want to use that to say, don't be shy to engage in public rulemaking, because you can have a big voice and make a difference. There were 227 comments submitted to this proposal. I'm embarrassed. I think that was a gross under response given the importance of this issue. So I'm eagerly awaiting to find out how the Bureau of Lands Management is going to respond to those comments, and there may be a second chance for input. I'm going to skip over that one and come back to it later. So how does faith inform my environmental stewardship perspective? I'm going to give a few different areas. The first is scripture. The second is in the Episcopal Baptismal Covenant. The third is in the relationship to other cultural influencers that are greatly important to me. And then finally, returning back to my training as a chemist and nutritionist, how I see science and faith converging into common care. I've taken from Genesis 1, the creation story that I think we're all familiar with, to make a particular point. Here in Genesis 1, in verse 3, God created the light, and in verse 4, saw it was good. In verse 9, separated the waters from the land, and 10, saw it was good, and so forth and so on. And you get down to where after man was created, what was God's response? And the answer is nada. That common response of saying it was good was held until God saw everything he had made in verse 31, and it was very good. And I think I've held on to this because I think it makes a really important point, and we gloss over it all the time because we think we have dominion, we have control, we have responsibility, we can do things. But it's in that context of the whole of creation that man can be part of what is very good, not alone from creation. So don't let that go. And a second scriptural reference in the second book of Genesis, one of the classic verses informing environmental care is this Garden of Eden setting, when the Lord God then took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden. To cultivate is this particular translation's word, but I put in parentheses other words that are also legitimate translations from the Greek: to till or to tend, to work for, to serve, to keep the land and care for it. This translation work was explored greatly by Ellen Davis, a professor of theology at Duke University, in a book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, which I highly recommend. And her bottom line, the four cornerstones of her conclusions from this study of Scripture, of the relationship between man and land, are summarized here. The land comes first. If the land is well tended, society will flourish. And Davis points out this is a covenant, that the covenant between God and man depends on the tending of the land. And she says what's not said, but is just as true, is that if we fail in this covenant, the land can be lost. Her second point is that informed ignorance is the result of a good education. And by that, she means we are 1,000,000 times more ignorant than we are knowledgeable. I'm going to show in my next to last slide a number of different areas of biology that we show how much we've learned, and physics and astronomy. And yes, we've learned a lot as a species. It's terrific. But we're also ignorant of a lot. So let's pay attention to what we don't know. The third one is an acknowledgement that materialism is necessary and that the land provides for that materialism. So let's acknowledge that, but let's also approach the usage for material goods in moderation. And I love to recall, when I see this phrase, the Billie Holiday line from God Bless the Child, that says, "You can help yourself, just don't take too much." And then her final point is that the land has value beyond price. And I think that's one of the things that's just creeping into the discussion now, that the land has intrinsic value of its own, independent of man's use of that land. This slide is my Episcopal background. We have in our baptismal covenant a series of questions. They're outlined here on the right. I'm not going to go through them, but the answer to each one of those questions is, I will, with God's help. And I think that is a really important statement that I'm hearing is applicable in the Latter-day Saints community, just like it is in the Episcopal community, that we have a responsibility to act. And I think I've come to feel comfortable in thinking about this responsibility, because I got into this area and I thought, what is it about the section of the Christian community that is resistant to taking action? And I heard, well, their perspective is that whatever's happening now is God's plan. And that seemed to be insurmountable, until I realized that as an Episcopalian, I've committed to do my part, and that must be part of God's plan too. My last point on this is that I had the good fortune of having our presiding bishop from the Episcopal Church at the cathedral in Spokane the day after our conference. And so I had the opportunity to ask the bishop if he wouldn't look into adding an additional pledge in our baptismal covenant that goes beyond the pledges for how we will respect our faith and our neighbors, but also to respect the creation. And he's said he'd look into that. So I'm encouraged that, yes, once again, one voice might help move things along. So coming up to the end here, I have a couple of things to show. This Aldo Leopold book, if you've not read that book, it's a cornerstone of the land ethic. I think it's written in poetic language and persuasive language. And similarly, Wendell Berry's 1978 publication, The Unsettling of America, where this still vibrant author and philosopher and farmer puts forth his ideas of the correct relationship between man and the land is laid out. Those are really important books. But Chief Self's comment I wanted to quote because it has a kicker. This we know, the earth does not belong to man, man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the earth, he does to himself. So our native tribes can teach us a lot, and that interesting element in the Bureau of Lands Management proposal was a requirement to consider indigenous knowledge to inform proper care of the land. I think there's a second element in that Bureau of Lands Management proposal, not just for the ability to conserve land, but what to consider when deciding how to conserve land that we should take an interest in. My last points are on science. I was trained in chemistry. This 0.529 times 10 to the minus 8 centimeters is the average distance between the proton in the hydrogen atom and the electron atom in that atom. And we know that with precision. That's amazing. We know how to use microwave ovens to heat the bond in water, to stretch that bond, and when it collapses, it creates heat and cooks. We know how to do that. We know in my own work that there's a vitamin A molecule in your eye that is sensitive to light and flips when a photon of light hits it and starts your vision process. We know that fungi in the forest are rudimentary from time immemorial that provide nutrients for the plants in the forest. I know that I can talk to my daughter in Japan and not have any hesitation in the phone communications. That's an amazing thing. So here's this image from Hubble of the pillars of creation, looking into space. Things that we have learned are great, and we know a lot about the environment now, scientifically, that is aligned with what faith has told us is our responsibility. I put the last one on because I'm a chemist. Atmospheric carbon dioxide, if it reaches the water, like the ocean, will equilibrate, and it will create carbonic acid and a hydrogen proton, which means whatever else is happening with global warming or sea level rise, we're also creating an acid ocean with profound potential consequence on life. So we have to act. My takeaway is we are a part of creation, this natural world that is very good, and that we can have an effect with God's help, that what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves, and that science and faith are not misaligned, they're in convergence on good stewardship of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. A lot of food for thought. We're really grateful to you for sharing those. And it's amazing how much we share in common with our faith. Our next panelist is Jeremiah Scanlan. Jeremiah is an avid bird watcher and fiction writer, and he's currently in his third year at law school at Harvard Law. He's been a student attorney with the animal law and environmental law clinics on campus, and he serves on the boards of the Harvard Law Latter-day Saints and the Harvard Animal Law Society. So we're thrilled to have you, Jeremiah, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you, John, for that great presentation. Also going to try sharing some slides. I guess someone shout out if it doesn't work. I'm going to assume that it's working. It turns out that a lot of what I wanted to share has actually already been shared by other people, so that's great. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself, hit on a few key points that I want to emphasize from what other people have said, and then that'll leave time for discussion, hopefully at the end, where we can talk more. A couple things that I forgot to include in that intro that Tom read, for your perspective, in case there's interest in comments, is that previous internship experiences that I've had have included being a Defenders of Wildlife in DC, which is a national nonprofit that focuses on wildlife issues. I was at the Department of Interior this previous summer. I was actually at working with the legal team that works with the Bureau of Land Management. And then I was also at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office in their Environmental Protection Division earlier this year. So I kind of had a flavor of a couple of different experiences, nonprofit, state, federal government. Still trying to figure out what I'm going to do after I graduate, but I do hope to be in government service sooner rather than later, is kind of my interest in. That's also kind of my interest in the law too, is natural resources, environmental law, and public lands. I think is a really interesting topic that I've done a lot of thinking about, and I did some work on, like I said, at the Interior Department. I like the topic of the panel, and I think what I wanted to offer is a couple of things from my own experiences of thinking about, when I think about that topic of bridging the divide between religion and environmentalism. The thing that I thought about immediately was like how, as people of faith, perhaps we can engage with the broader environmental community, and also I'll throw in some legal thoughts in there as well. And I say that to get into it, I say that, I guess, as someone who my faith is very important to me and like really influences my interests in environmental issues. And I've always felt a little weird about that. I grew up in the East. That's why I have a picture of the blue jay on here. Some of you Westerners may not be as familiar with maybe more familiar with the Western cousins of the blue jay, but hopefully you get to see one. And so I've always had this interest from a young age for these issues. And that's what I've carried into law school. But I've often felt a bit of an oddball, a bit of an outsider, because I come to these issues from a particular angle that's influenced by my faith. And sometimes I feel like that's weird. Like maybe people don't want to talk about that. But there are two experiences that have changed that for me. On the left is Kathy Meyer. I took the animal law clinic, was an animal law clinic participant. Harvard has an animal law clinic. She's the director of it. She is a pioneer and kind of a legend in the animal legal movement. I'm interested in biodiversity issues in particular, and endangered species, and so that's why I wanted to take it. But I came into it thinking, like, what are they going to think of me? This like Mormon thinks he can get involved in this, and like Kathy, like this self-described hippie and vegan and cool lady. What would she think? And like it came up in our first meeting together, and she was like, "You're Mormon?" She's very extroverted and outspoken, I would say. And it came up, and it was fine. She was interested, and if not, didn't really matter to the work. She was happy to have me on board. On the right is Andy Mergen, who is the director of the Environmental Law Clinic here at Harvard. And I had a similar experience with him. He had been at government he had been at the Justice Department in their environmental division for 30 years. And when I asked him about government careers and was curious about what kind of path I could have there, one of the things he said to me was, at the Department of Justice, we're interested in having particularly LDS people, because they understand Western issues. They know what the environment is. And, there was maybe, I think at the time that he was there, he mentioned maybe like 2 or 3 BYU, grads. I'm a BYU grad, and not that all, we all have to be BYU grads, but there's only 2 or 3 in the entire Department of Justice's environmental division. So my point is, I think that it's important for us to show up as people of faith in these spaces, and I think it's welcomed. And if it's not welcomed, there's so many crises that are going on that I don't think that people really care. I think they're happy to have another person on the team, another person to row with them. So that's my first thing I want to say for bridging that gap, is that get involved. For me, that has meant that I hopefully will get to devote my career to it. But we can't all have that choice. And if you're someone who has only like 30 minutes on a Saturday to do that, I want to talk about a few different ways that you can also get involved from a legal perspective, and would love to talk more in the discussion section, because I'm just going to fly by a couple of these. And again, other people have already mentioned. One of them is, of course, getting involved in federal lawmaking and writing to your representatives. We had someone from SUA on earlier, and she talked about the great efforts that they're doing there. I'm going to mention SUA again because I think that they do a lot of great work in this space. But somebody else mentioned, I think too, that our environmental statutes are big ones. The Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, mostly passed decades ago, and are maybe not exactly up to the challenges of today. And so if we want new laws passed, we need to be advocating for it. But that one, we're engaged citizens. I want to talk about something maybe that is less obvious. And real fast, I should mention too that when I'm talking about these things in terms of bridging the gap between religion and the environment, I put on this slide right before, because somebody mentioned the Wilderness Act, and I was like, oh, I've got to talk about the Wilderness Act too. I think it's really interesting looking at laws insofar as we feel like the law does not reflect whatever we feel or should be the priorities of the government and the way that we have a relationship with the land. Like it's written into the law. And I think a prime example of that is comparing the Bureau of Land Management's primary statute, FLTMA, on the left, and the Wilderness Act on the right. FLTMA, I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see that there's a bajillion different things that are supposed to happen on BLM managed lands, or that BLM managed lands are encouraged to be used for, including in kind of at the bottom there, that they are used for resources, including minerals, food, timber. The Wilderness Act, on the other hand, has a completely different approach, and that's the way that the law was written. And I think Aldo Leopold, who's been mentioned a couple times, I think he had a hand in writing part of the statute where it's recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, or man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And there's a huge range of different ways that we treat public lands. Everything, these are kind of maybe the two ends of it, I would say. National Park Service has Park Service lands that are more conservation minded, but not exactly Wilderness Act. So the point is, if we want to see our values in the law, we need to change the law. One of the ways to do that is by, writing your senators. The other, and arguably in some ways in today's era, the more important one is getting involved in agencies. Agencies do a ton of maybe primarily the lawmaking today. And there are ways to be involved here, which John also mentioned. And so I think that's great. This is just one example. Well, when an agency writes a rule, a lot of the times that has to go up for something called notice and comment, which means that they solicit comments from the public. And as John said, I think that regulators and people who are writing these rules, they really do take seriously these comments. In fact, they are required by law to read all of the comments and offer some kind of response to them. The public lands rule has been a very controversial one, and because of that, BLM held meetings over the summer earlier this year. None of them were in Utah, unfortunately, for those of you who are in Utah, but I think there were ones in Nevada and Colorado. So there are these opportunities to be involved, to submit comments, to have your voice heard, and the government is required to take notice of that. that's like difficult to do. It's hard to keep up with federal rulemaking. Like this is a topic that I'm interested in, and I don't even know half the things that the government is up to at half the time. So there are organizations that do this for us and help us kind of streamline and put issues in front of us that they think are important. So I would encourage you to be involved in those organizations, subscribe to their mailing lists. Again, SUA, I think, is a really great example. They do a lot of commenting on agency rulemaking, and they have ways of helping you have comment language that you can submit. And I'd encourage you too, that when you're submitting that comment language, that you personalize it. And I think this is a way for us to show up as people of faith, is to write about how those values influence our our decisions and the reasons that we're advocating for something. To close, I'll just echo this great thing that George Handley said. Religion is a call to faithful and moral action on behalf of what we love. And so I think, again, if what we love is the environment and we want to have faith and want to take direct action, I think that's a really important thing to do, is that our faith will to bridge that gap between religion and environmentalism. We should be acting, we should be trying to see our values put into practice. So thanks for hearing from me, and excited to hear more in the discussion and hear from more from our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. A lot of food for thought, and from a lawyer to another, there's a lot we can do. That's great. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Representative Gay Lynn Bennion. She graduated from BYU with a bachelor's degree in English, and her husband, Jim, served 26 years active duty in the Air Force. Their 4 children were born in 4 different states. That sounds challenging. She served in Women's States Legislative Council of Utah leadership for 7 years, and she also volunteered to teach English to immigrants and refugees through English Skills Learning Center for 5 years, and served in a state chapter leadership for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense. She was elected to represent House District 46 in 2020, and the district, now District 41, includes Alta, Brighton, most of Cottonwood Heights, and part of Holiday, Midvale, and Murray. She serves on the following committees: Natural Resources, Agriculture and Environmental Quality, Political Subdivisions, Administrative Rules Committee, and Veterans and Military Affairs Commission. Thank you so much, Gay, for being with us, and take it away.
Okay. I just want to thank everyone for having this event. I think I have grown a lot through the years that I've been associated with MESA. And one of the things I learned about that I've tried to get moving here in Utah is reducing school food waste. And I learned about that through MESA. I wanted to just share what brought me as a legislator to focus on the environment. As we came back to visit family years ago, we came in the plane through really horrible air quality, where you could see how bad the air quality was. And all of my 5 siblings and my parents still live here in Utah. So I thought about my nieces and nephews and the impacts of that air on their lives, and I wanted to make a difference. And so I think that's one of the things that when I joined Women's State Legislative Council of Utah, I had the opportunity to choose which committee I was on, I think, and I chose Natural Resources. And one of the most impressive experiences I had during those years was being able to bring from the University of Utah Law School, Bob Kiter and John Ruppel in the Wallace Stegner Center. I invited John Ruppel to come and share his white paper about the federal lands. And this, back when I first started in that group, we had this federalism pushed in lawsuits that these were state lands that needed to come back to Utah. And that white paper talks about that these have always been federal lands, and that all the lands that Utah has were given to them by the federal government. I also am inspired by the district I represent to focus on the environment. If you look at a physical printout of what this district is, the majority of it is Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons. And the beauty and the water that they provide for all of us here in this valley is so critical and important that we protect and preserve it. And then I just wanted to share some of the experiences I've had as I've served on that committee and the things that I've seen that are exciting around the state. First of all, after my first session in office, I had the opportunity to have a volunteer intern, and I asked her to look through our legislative audits on natural resources. And she found that the Watershed Restoration Initiative, which is a program unique to Utah, that for the past 17 years now, I think, has been improving our watersheds. Every dollar that is put into them results in $5 of benefit to Utah through their collaboration with the federal government and counties and nonprofits. And we were able to put that watershed restoration into state code because of her work. And that sounds like it wasn't maybe that big a deal, except as we were drafting the bill, Summit County reached out and said, can you create an endowment fund so that when we have money, we can give it to the Watershed Restoration Initiative and then use it the following year to do work in our county. So we did that. They gave $1 million the first year, $10 million the next. So we're able to, as we collaborate, really improve and increase our efforts to improve the land and watersheds. Another exciting experience I've had is to see the collaboration between our state and federal governments. Last year, we were invited to go on a tour of Beaver Mountain and see the work that has been done there to reduce the risk of wildfire and to pull out dead wood and have prescribed burn. And that was wonderful for me to see the collaboration, because there is a great deal of amount of pushback in our state. And I was able to lock eyes with Director Reg Johnson and acknowledge the progress that they are making together. And I've been able to go and see this work happening in our watersheds currently in Mill Creek Canyon. And one other exciting thing I was able to do this past summer is out in Eagle Mountain. They are working on creating a wildlife corridor crossing. And this is a nonprofit grassroots group working with the city, working with the Douglas Proving Grounds to create this protected wildlife crossing through fences, through under roadway pathways to get the deer and other wildlife through this new city that has moved so far into undeveloped land in a safe way. So that was very encouraging for me to see. That city, Eagle Mountain, has their own city biologist. That's how dedicated they are to trying to remediate the impacts that they are putting on the land there. And then just a few more things. I wanted everyone here to know that there is a bipartisan Great Salt Lake Caucus. It is not meeting often enough, but we do meet. Last session, we met every week of the session. We need to meet more during the time outside of the session. Representative Doug Owens is fundamental to keeping that group going, and I'm glad to serve on that. And I want to acknowledge the work that I'm doing right now with Soren Simonson and other people in our state on riparian corridors. So we have a working group and a bill to hopefully within the next 5 years that each city and county within our state will have a vision of what they want for their riparian corridor, and that we will be providing the tools and information and staff to help them find their riparian corridors and to create the vision and begin the work of what they want. And I can talk more about any of that during the question. And I I think for a lot of us, this is a time when our faith is pushed. I served a mission for this faith in Mexico. I've been a part of this church throughout the country, serving in leadership throughout the country. And yet right now, as I see and think about things like protection of our leadership when they know of sexual child abuse, it's very painful for me to stay in the church. There are other things that are, particularly in my family with LGBTQ members, I would like them to feel more welcome within the church. And so I'm grateful for a group like this that helps us all be honest with each other and helps me see the breadth of people that are within religion and working on these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Representative Bennion. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Kira Smiley, and briefly, she's a senior program manager for Project Tidal at X. I can't wait to hear about that. The Moonshot Factory, formerly Google X, working on developing high impact technologies to unlock sustainable long-term productivity and economics of the ocean while managing, protecting, and restoring. Before Tidal, she worked as a program manager for Project Delta at X, a team focused on creating smarter food systems. Outside of her day-to-day role, Kira co-leads the sustainability working group within her Women at X employee resource group. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Earth Systems with a minor in Japanese and a Master of Science in Earth Systems, focused on sustainable global food security and the environment. While at Stanford, she was awarded the Dozier Public Engagement Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science for her work as part of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, and a 2018 Stanford Earth Systems Award for outstanding research. So thank you for being here, Kira.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be able to speak with everyone and humbled by everyone's introductions and comments before this. I'll try and keep my introduction and initial thoughts brief so we have some time for discussion. But in addition to the introduction, I wanted to share that my lens on environmentalism and of course my background with religion has intersected in lots of different ways. First and foremost, I think it's been split between doing a lot of community engagement and organization through work with wards, with my own LDS student group while I was at Stanford, and wards after that, in working to really engage and get involved with, for example, building out a role or an actual calling around environmental stewardship coordinator, and working to build out tools and resources, toolkits, so that we can have events and so that we can hold space for doing work with environmentalism. At the same time, today, my role and what I do at X really comes on not so much from an NGO or a political or a legal lens, but really from an economic lens, where we are first and foremost creating technologies and products that we think and that are actually proving value while being environmentally sustainable. And so that is to say that often we see that there may be some conflict between what is seen as something that is more government driven or trying to be more NGO driven, but really there is a lot of value to be had also from an economic sense in terms of promoting sustainability, promoting environmentalism, and promoting the tools and technologies and businesses that can help create that and can help perpetuate that as part of society. So my background, beyond what was mentioned, I've done some work across various different areas. That includes the Center on Food Security and the Environment at the Freeman Spogli Institute, working at the Finnish Environment Institute, working at the National Audubon Society, which Jeremiah, I'm sure, will appreciate, and working in Japan at the Mitsubishi Research Institute for energy and environment. And in 2020, I had the opportunity to speak with Sister Eubank at the Fall Forum with the LDSES organization, which may have some crossover here with MESA. But what I thought was really interesting out of that was we often, even the topic of this this conversation, which is how can we bridge the divide that sometimes exists between religion and environmentalism, I would take a step back and say, I honestly don't think there's necessarily a bridge between religion and environmentalism. I think that there's other identity roles that we have and incorporate that have caused some of that rift. And I think it's really critical that we don't stay very myopic to specifically thinking about our roles in this divide, which is fairly US focused. I'm actually a dual citizen between the US and Finland. And what I've seen is the type of divide that we have today and the sort of reticence to adopt environmental principles because we see some kind of conflict there with other identities that we hold is something that is very, very American centric and not something that I see globally necessarily. And so taking that global perspective, I think is really important. The other piece to this is actually, I think it was John who mentioned the love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that today, something that's really critical that we think of is loving thy neighbor as thyself. Today, the world is so interconnected and so completely, intricately involved with itself and with each other that it is impossible to see your neighbor as anyone else than people all across the planet. Because worldwide, all of the choices and all of the things that we do have a direct impact on others. And the systems that are in place also lead to that. And so what I would say maybe as a main point here is that if we can look to reframe what we see as environmentalism, which nomenclature has been sort of co-opted and held tightly by the political left, and reframe that as something that is much more human-centric and human-focused around brotherhood and sisterhood, around stewardship, and around human-centric impacts, which for better, for worse, really for worse, now are very visible in a way that they weren't even a decade or 2 decades ago. Then we start to be able to really focus on that, love thy neighbor as thyself, really being able to focus on taking those stewardship principles and seeing it as a gift and something we're responsible for caring for. And so I think that's something that we can really focus on doing. And I would love to have a discussion with the other panelists about is how do we pull in the religious texts, the talk from our leaders, from, for example, Elder Kosei, we've heard from Neil A. Maxwell, from Elder M. Russell Ballard, Elder Stephen E. Snow, many different talks around this, who are starting to speak more publicly about environmentalism. And how do we leverage that to create a much more inclusive conversation such that people don't feel alienated and people feel like they can be part of it because it's just impacting their day-to-day lives and their health and their family. And if we can start doing that, then I think we can start leveraging and really rapidly expediting the progress that we've been making to this point with this work on environmentalism and really begin to bridge that gap. So that's primarily, I'll keep it very short. And so that's primarily the main point I want to make. And I'm excited to now move more into conversation and start having that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara. That's wonderful. And we've got a lot of great questions that we can ask the panelists as a whole. We could start with Kara's question if you want to do that, which is, how do we leverage these great statements by Bishop Kosei, Elder Ballard, Elder Snow, and so forth, and to not feel alienated and marginalized? How do we bridge that gap? So let me turn it over to the panelists.
If I can jump in and speak just initially to that, I think one piece that's interesting specifically within the context of the United States is that if we look at, I mentioned many identities, right? So within US Christianity, primarily it's about 61% are identify, or 36% of adults across the US who are religious identify as conservative and 33% as moderate. Within the US, it's about 61, or within the US with LDS members, it's actually 61% is conservative identifying and 27% are moderate, which is higher than any other religious group. But I think that what we've seen historically is that it was only around maybe the Al Gore era that environmentalism became much more associated with the political left. And what we saw before that was, someone mentioned this, but the EPA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, those were all created under a conservative presidency. And so that is to say that if we can have people sort of take their mindset and focus less on that part of it and more on their identification as someone who is a steward, who is a brother and a sister, who is a family member, and have them really dig into that part of their identity and their identity as a follower of Christ, then I think that you create the mental space to be much more open to starting to engage, is one piece that I would add.
Great. Other panelists want to speak to that?
I'd love to. Oh, sorry, John, did you have
No, that's
something? No, I think that's a great point that you made, Kira. And yeah, something I've thought about and maybe definitely want to keep thinking about. My first thought is just like on the very simple, like within our leveraging our whatever we can within our communities to like bring up these topics in a way that kind of conforms with like the project of community. That's kind of vague language. I'll say for me personally, I'm the Sunday school president in my ward. And so I'm like, why have we not had a lesson on Bishop Cousset's talk? Like that would be fantastic. I don't know if that's happened. And then the second thought, I mean, I guess just to echo what you're saying, some like specific examples of like tapping into people's identities that they already have to work towards good and see how those things overlap. I think, there's a lot of ways to interact with, I hope, with people who come at conservation maybe from like a recreationist standpoint or from like a sportsman standpoint. I think often there are times to have opportunities to have conversations with people who are interested in those issues, who maybe also don't want to see extractive uses, or at the very least, we can find ways to overlap on the things that we care about and maybe learn from other people as well. Yeah.
Can I just come back to Kira's comment about our different identities? I think I mentioned in my earlier comments that one of the surprises to me was when I was thinking of the American Christian community, that there were parts in that community that were the most vocal opponents to environmental care. That the conversation, in their words, was about it's our use of the land. We can do what we need to do and exploit. And I think that's a result of a failure in our religious instruction. So it's overcome in conversation by getting out of your comfort zone and getting across into other communities so that they know there's a Christian community that is very much aligned with other people's interests.